All right, buckle up, because today we are diving into the whirlwind world of an Austin City Council meeting.
Oh, wow.
You heard that right. We've got meeting minutes,
You are kidding.
transcripts,
Yeah.
even a proclamation from the mayor himself.
This is going to be good.
So get ready to become the most informed person at your next water cooler chat.
You really outdid yourself with this material, by the way.
Well, gotta keep things interesting, right?
It's amazing what goes on behind the scenes. All those policies, all those decisions.
Then we're gonna uncover it all.
We're talking about the real people, the real stories,
The hidden tensions.
the stuff that makes local government actually, well, interesting.
Exactly. So let's jump right in with the consent agenda.
Oh boy, the consent agenda. Fasten your seatbelts.
Usually it's a blur, right?
Mm-hmm.
A bunch of items they try to approve quickly.
Right. Get it over with, move on.
Exactly. But wait, hold on. What's this? A name misspelling.
Ooh, juicy.
They're correcting the record for a Samantha Lidkey and withdrawing some items.
Okay, so little details, big deal.
It's like a tiny drama unfolding right there in the minutes.
It's easy to overlook those details, but accuracy, oh, it matters, especially in local government. And that name, Lidkey, it rings a bell.
Wait, really?
Yeah, she's actually involved in a lawsuit against the Austin Police Department.
No way.
Yep, comes up later in the meeting.
Ooh, foreshadowing. Okay, I'm hooked already.
Right.
And speaking of intrigue, Councilmember Harper Madison is absent for this meeting.
Oh, that's interesting, yeah. I noticed that in the transcript, seems to be a bit of a recurring theme.
Right, it makes you wonder what's going on there.
It does. And, it highlights how important every single voice is on the council, especially because some of these decisions, we'll see, they need 9 votes to pass.
9 votes? Wow, so every vote counts.
Exactly. Harper Madison being absent, it changes the whole dynamic,
So every vote is a nail-biter. Gotcha. Now, this next item is where things get really interesting.
Ooh, let's hear it.
We're talking zoning cases.
The classic.
And this one, oh boy, it perfectly illustrates that whole not in my backyard phenomenon. We're talking about a proposed duplex in the Robertson-Stuart Murray Historic District.
Okay, I'm familiar with that area.
And it turns into this whole debate about what defines a neighborhood's soul.
Ah, the age-old question, right?
Yeah.
What makes a place unique? What makes it worth preserving?
Exactly. You've got Matt Jordan. He's an applicant. He wants to develop his property.
Makes sense. Property rights,
Right. Totally understandable. But then you have longtime residents like Mrs. Little who, they believe this construction will totally change the character of their community.
And they've got a point. These historic districts, they have a certain charm, a certain feel.
And the visuals they use just add to the drama. One resident showed a picture of a utility pole to try and prove the new building wouldn't block anyone's view.
A utility pole.
Yeah, a utility pole. It's in the transcript.
People are passionate. I'll give them that.
Right. But everyone can see it's totally misleading. It's not even a close call.
It just goes to show you how subjective this whole idea of compatibility is.
Especially when we're talking about historic preservation. It's all about interpretation, right?
Exactly. And what doesn't help? Apparently, Mr. Jordan, he didn't exactly do a stellar job reaching out to his neighbors before all this.
Oh, really?
Yeah. From what I gathered, his community outreach was, well, let's just say it could have been better.
Oof. Yeah, that never helps. So now the council's stuck. Do they side with the residents, or do they prioritize the need for more housing? It's like the classic Austin dilemma, right?
A tough one. On one hand, you've got people who've poured their hearts and souls into these neighborhoods.
Trying to protect what they love.
Right, exactly. And on the other hand, you've got a growing city.
And a desperate need for more housing.
It's a tricky balancing act, that's for sure. And it gets even trickier when you bring in things like the whole McMansion debate. Have you heard about this?
Oh, yeah, the McMansions. Those massive houses that sometimes pop up in the middle of these historic districts.
Exactly. It makes you wonder, what do we really value about historical significance? Is it about preserving a certain aesthetic, a certain scale, or is it about something more?
That's a great question, and it's one that Austin is grappling with more and more every day.
It's a conversation that's only going to get more heated as the city continues to grow and evolve.
Speaking of heated conversations, let's shift gears to a different kind of battle.
Okay, hit me.
This one's about Development versus the environment.
Ah, another classic Austin showdown.
Right. We're talking about the Barton Creek watershed, that crown jewel of Austin's natural beauty.
Beautiful area.
The proposed West Creek mixed-use project, which is a big apartment complex.
Okay, I'm seeing where this is going.
It pits the need for growth against the importance of safeguarding this sensitive ecosystem.
It's a tale as old as time. Growth versus preservation.
And in Austin, it's a battle that's constantly being waged.
And the stakes are high. We're talking about the future of the city, the quality of life for its residents.
Exactly. And the documents you found, especially those resident testimonies, they do a great job of capturing those concerns.
Oh, the testimonies, yeah, those are always illuminating. Raw, unfiltered, straight from the heart.
We're talking traffic nightmares, parking shortages, stormwater runoff.
And don't forget those iconic heritage trees.
Right. People are passionate about those trees.
And for good reason. They're part of the city's history, its character. You can't just replace a 100-year-old tree overnight.
Exactly. And you know what else is interesting? There's actually a legal dimension to all of this. We're talking about impervious cover limits, which basically dictate how much concrete you can have on a property.
Right, trying to reduce that runoff, protect the watershed.
Exactly. Then there's restrictive covenants, and of course the famous Save Our Springs Ordinance. Have you heard of that?
Have I heard of it? Please, it's like the environmental Bible in these parts.
Right.
You can't talk about Austin's environment without mentioning the Save Our Springs Ordinance.
It's serious business.
It really is. It's a testament to how seriously this city takes environmental activism. And you know what? It's shaped development in the Barton Creek watershed for decades.
That's impressive. So it sounds like this case is really a prime example of that ongoing tug of war between development and conservation, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And, it's not just about rules and regulations. It's about people's lives.
Right. Real people who are directly impacted by these decisions.
Exactly. Take Ms. Menard, for instance. She delivered this incredibly moving testimony.
What did she say?
Well, she's facing potential displacement because of a rezoning request. Imagine that. Your home, your neighborhood, your entire life upended by a zoning change.
It's a stark reminder of the human cost of development, isn't it?
It is. And it's a reminder that behind all the zoning jargon, behind all the maps and plans, there are real people with real lives who are directly impacted by these decisions.
It's easy to forget that sometimes when we're caught up in the weeds of it all. But you're right. These are people's homes, their communities, their lives we're talking about.
Exactly. And it often feels like an uphill battle for residents when they're up against these big developers with deep pockets.
Right. It can feel like David versus Goliath sometimes. Speaking of which, you're not going to believe what one resident said about trying to negotiate with the developer.
Okay, now you got me curious.
So there's this thing called a restrictive covenant, right? Basically, it's an agreement that limits what can be built on a property.
All right, I'm familiar with those.
So this resident, his name is Gene Adams, he compared trying to negotiate this restrictive covenant with the developer to herding cats.
That's a good one.
I know, right?
It perfectly captures the frustration, the absurdity of it all.
Right. And it's funny, but it also highlights this very real sense of powerlessness that many residents feel when they're dealing with these big development projects.
Absolutely. And these aren't just abstract policy discussions. They're about real people trying to make their voices heard, trying to have a say in what happens in their own communities.
And some residents feel like those voices aren't being heard. I'm looking at the transcripts now, and the testimony about the city's notification processes is just heartbreaking.
Oh, the notification process. Yeah, that's a whole other can of worms.
People feel left in the dark, like decisions are being made without their input.
It's a common complaint, and for good reason.
Right. It makes you wonder, how can we expect people to engage in a meaningful way when they don't even know what's going on?
Exactly. It all comes down to transparency and accessibility.
Two words that don't always seem to go hand in hand with local government, unfortunately.
You're telling me. But seriously, how do we ensure that residents have a genuine say in the decisions that directly impact their lives? That's the million-dollar question.
It's a question that every city grapples with, but it seems especially pertinent here in Austin, given our rapid growth and the constant tension between preserving what we love about this city and embracing the changes that come with progress.
You hit the nail on the head.
Oh.
It's a balancing act, and one that we haven't always gotten right. But you know what? I'm hopeful.
Me too.
Yep.
There are a lot of passionate, engaged people in this city who care deeply about its future. And as long as we keep those conversations going, as long as we keep pushing for transparency and accountability, I think we have a shot at getting it right.
I agree. And speaking of weighty matters, this next item in the agenda takes us from the local to the global,
Oh, let's hear it.
the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Wow. It's not every day you see a global issue like that debated at a city council meeting.
It's pretty remarkable when you think about it. But it just goes to show you, local government, it's not always about potholes and zoning ordinances. Sometimes it's about grappling with issues that have global implications.
And this issue in particular, it's one that evokes strong emotions, deeply held beliefs. It's a complex issue with a long and often painful history. I'm curious to hear how the council even begins to address something like this.
Me too. And, from the transcripts, it's clear this wasn't just a symbolic gesture. There were impassioned arguments from both sides.
Which makes sense given the gravity of the situation.
Exactly. And it underscores the complexities and sensitivities of this decades-long conflict.
Absolutely. You've got terms like genocide, apartheid,
Hmm.
and anti-Semitism being thrown around. Clearly, this is an issue that people feel very strongly about. But it made me wonder, what can a city council realistically do about a conflict that's happening on the other side of the world?
That's the big question, isn't it? And it's one that I'm sure many people were asking themselves during that meeting.
So what's the answer?
Well, I don't know if there's an easy answer. The council may not have direct influence on international relations, but that doesn't mean they're powerless.
Right, they can still take a stand, raise awareness, and maybe even influence policy at a higher level.
Exactly. And perhaps even more importantly, they can create a space for dialogue, for
Yeah.
understanding, for empathy. Because even though this is a global conflict, it has very real local impacts.
That's a really important point. We often think of these global issues as something that's happening over there, but the reality is they touch all of our lives in some way.
Exactly. And in Austin, we have a vibrant and diverse community with people from all walks of life, from all over the world. So when something like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is being debated, it's not just some abstract political debate. It's personal.
Right, it's about our neighbors, our friends, our colleagues. It's about the fabric of our community.
Exactly. And I think that's something that's important to keep in mind, not just with this issue, but with any issue that comes before the council. These aren't just abstract policy debates. They're about real people's lives.
Well said. And speaking of real people's lives, let's dive back into the often confusing world of zoning, shall we?
Oh boy, buckle up. It's about to get technical.
Right. It's easy to get lost in the weeds with all the codes and regulations, but trust me, this meeting had some real gems when it comes to deciphering those zoning mysteries.
I live for this stuff. Lay it on me.
All right, so remember our friend, DB90.
DB90, how could I forget? It's like the Beyonce of Austin zoning codes. Everyone's talking about it, but no one seems to fully understand it.
Huh. That's a perfect analogy, but you're right. It's this zoning tool that's supposed to encourage density bonuses for affordable housing.
Which on paper sounds like a noble goal, right?
Right. Who wouldn't want more affordable housing?
Exactly. But as with many things in life, the devil is in the details.
And those details, oh boy, they can be tricky.
So what kind of DB90 drama unfolded in this meeting?
Well, we hear from residents like Mr. Doyle who feel like the city's pulling a bait and switch when it comes to DB90 and preserving neighborhood character.
Ah, the classic bait and switch. Promise one thing, deliver another.
Exactly. And don't even get me started on the intricacies of valid petitions and those 9-vote overrides.
Ooh, 9-vote overrides. Those are high stakes.
Right. It's like a whole new level of political maneuvering. It's enough to make your head spin.
I can see why people get frustrated.
Yeah.
It's their city, their neighborhoods, their lives that are being impacted by these decisions. And when they feel like the rules are constantly changing or that they're not being given a fair shake, well, that's when the distrust starts to creep in.
Exactly. And once that trust is eroded, it's hard to get it back.
That's like trying to put toothpaste back in the tube, messy and nearly impossible.
Perfect analogy. And speaking of messy, let's talk about another hot topic that came up in this meeting, a proposed gas rate hike by Texas Gas Service.
Oh boy, gas prices. Always a crowd pleaser.
Right. I'll admit my eyes glazed over a bit at first, all those numbers and charts. But then it hit me, this is about your money, my money, everyone's money.
Exactly. It's easy to tune out when it comes to rate cases, but this is where the rubber meets the road for a lot of people. We're talking about our monthly bills, our budgets, our ability to make ends meet.
And let's be real, no one wants to pay more for gas than they have to. So what was the justification for this rate hike?
Well, according to Texas Gas Service, it's all about infrastructure improvements, inflation, the usual suspects. But of course, The Sierra Club and several residents raised some valid concerns.
Like what kind of concerns did they raise?
Well, they questioned whether these rate hikes were truly justified, or if they were just a way for the utility company to pad its profits. They also raised concerns about the impact on low-income residents, who are already struggling to avoid their bills.
That's a really important point because when you're living paycheck to paycheck, even a small increase in your utility bills can make a big difference.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And it's not just about the money either. The Sierra Club also raised concerns about the environmental impact of these rate hikes,
Mhm.
arguing that they would discourage people from switching to renewable energy sources.
So it's a complex issue with no easy answers. But it sounds like the city's hands are somewhat tied because of the Railroad Commission, right? That state agency that regulates utilities.
Mm, exactly. This is where things get a little tricky. Because even though the city council sets the rates for gas service within Austin, they don't have complete control. The Railroad Commission has the final say, and they don't always side with the city or its residents.
It's a good reminder that even local government is subject to forces beyond its control.
It's like a game of chess, you know?
Yeah.
You got to think several moves ahead and anticipate your opponent's next move.
And in this case, it seems like the Railroad Commission is a formidable opponent. But, even if the city can't directly control the rates, they can still advocate for their residents, hold the utility company accountable, and explore alternative solutions.
Absolutely. And that's what I love about local government. It's where we can really see democracy in action.
Right. It's where we can make our voices heard, hold our elected officials accountable, and hopefully shape our communities for the better.
Well said. And speaking of coming full circle, this meeting takes us back to a familiar face, Samantha Lidke,
Wait, Samantha Lidke, the misspelled name from the beginning of the meeting.
the one and only. It's like we've gone from a misspelled name to a multi-million-dollar lawsuit.
What happened? Give me the details.
So remember how we talked about that lawsuit she filed against the Austin Police Department? Well, this time, it's not about the lawsuit itself, but about the legal fees associated with it.
Okay, I'm listening. Legal fees can be a real killer.
Tell me about it. Well, it turns out the city is on the hook for those legal fees. And guess what? They just got a whole lot higher.
How much higher are we talking?
The council just approved a significant increase.
Whoa, that's a big deal. What's the story there?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Unfortunately, the council decided to discuss this whole thing behind closed doors in a closed executive session.
Closed session. So much for transparency.
I know. It's frustrating, but there are some legitimate reasons for those closed sessions, especially when you're dealing with sensitive legal matters or personnel issues.
Okay, I get it. But it still feels a little secretive, don't you think?
I hear you. It's a tough balance to strike between transparency and confidentiality.
It makes you wonder what they're trying to hide.
The key is to ensure that these closed sessions are used appropriately and not as a way to avoid public scrutiny. Accountability is crucial.
Right. We need to hold our elected officials accountable, and that means demanding transparency even when it's uncomfortable.
Exactly. We can't just blindly trust that everything is above board. We have to stay informed, ask tough questions, and make our voices heard. That's how we make sure that our government is truly working for us.
Well said. It's a good reminder that even in a city as progressive as Austin, there's always room for improvement, always a need to hold our leaders accountable, and always a reason to stay engaged in the democratic process.
Absolutely. And, on that note, this meeting throws us another curveball. We're back to that familiar tension development versus the environment.
Oh no, not another battle over the Barton Creek watershed.
You guessed it. It seems like this issue is always simmering beneath the surface in Austin.
It's like a pot of water that's always on the verge of boiling over.
Exactly. And this time, the heat is coming from a proposed development project that's raising all sorts of red flags, especially when it comes to its potential impact on the Edwards Aquifer.
Okay, now we're talking about some serious stuff. The Edwards Aquifer is like the lifeblood of this region.
Tell me about it. Millions of people rely on it for their drinking water.
So what's the deal with this development project? Why is it causing such a stir?
Well, from the looks of it, this project is situated right in the heart of the recharge zone for the Edwards Aquifer.
The recharge zone.
Yeah, that's the area where water from the surface can seep down and replenish the aquifer.
Oh, right. I remember learning about that in school. It's like a giant underground sponge that soaks up water.
Exactly. But if you build on top of that sponge, if you cover it with concrete and asphalt, it can't absorb water as effectively. And that means less water for the aquifer, which means less water for all of us.
Yikes. That's a recipe for disaster, especially in a place like Austin, where water is already a precious resource.
You got it. And that's why this particular case is causing such a ruckus. You've got residents, environmental groups, even some members of the council who are saying, hold on a minute, we need to take a closer look at this before we greenlight a project that could have such far-reaching consequences.
I mean, it makes sense, right? We've already seen what happens when we don't take care of our environment.
Exactly. And with the Edwards Aquifer, the stakes are even higher. We're not just talking about protecting a few trees or a scenic view. We're talking about safeguarding the drinking water for millions of people.
That's a powerful argument. So what happened? Did the council approve of the project?
You know, for once, it seems like they're actually pumping the brakes.
Oh, really? That's a nice change of pace.
They decided to postpone the vote on this project until they could get more information about its potential environmental impact.
That's good to hear. It gives everyone a chance to breathe, do their homework, and hopefully come back to the table with a more sustainable solution.
Exactly. And, it just goes to show you that even in the face of intense development pressure, it's possible to prioritize environmental protection.
It's all about finding that balance, right? Between growth and preservation, between progress and responsibility. It's a tough needle to thread, but it's not impossible.
And you know what gives me hope? The fact that so many people in this city are willing to stand up and fight for what they believe in.
Absolutely. Whether it's protecting our environment, demanding affordable housing, or holding our elected officials accountable, the people of Austin have a long and proud tradition of activism.
And as long as we keep that spirit alive, I think we have a fighting chance of creating a city that works for everyone.
Well said. And on that note of cautious optimism, we'll wrap up part one of our deep dive into this epic city council meeting.
Don't worry, we're just getting started. There's plenty more drama, intrigue, and civic engagement where that came from.
So stay tuned, folks. You won't want to miss the next installment of our City Council Chronicles. You know what's fascinating about all this? It's like we're getting this little peek behind the curtain of city government, seeing how these decisions are made, who's involved, what the stakes are.
It's like we're armchair activists.
Exactly. And speaking of activism, this next item takes us back to that ongoing battle between development and the environment. Remember that not in my backyard mentality we were talking about earlier?
Oh yeah, that's a classic. People want progress, but not in their own backyards.
Exactly. And this case is a perfect example of that. We're talking about, once again, the Barton Creek watershed.
That beloved, yet perpetually embattled watershed. What's going on this time?
So there's this proposed development project,
Another one.
and it's causing quite a stir because of its potential impact on, you guess it, the environment.
This watershed is like a magnet for development drama. What are the specifics on this one? What's getting people fired up?
Well, we hear from Mrs. Berry, the president of the West Creek Neighborhood Association.
Okay, she's a force to be reckoned with. I've seen her in action at other meetings.
She is fired up about this project.
What are her main concerns? Traffic, flooding, noise. It's usually a combination of things with these developments.
Oh, you name it, she's concerned about it. Increased traffic, more stormwater runoff, the potential loss of those beautiful heritage trees.
Ah, yes, the heritage trees. Always a sticking point. People get very attached to those trees, and for good reason. They're part of the city's history, its character.
And you can't just replace a 100-year-old tree overnight.
Absolutely not. It takes decades, if not centuries, for a tree to reach that kind of stature, to provide that kind of shade, that kind of ecological benefit. Trees are like the elders of our community. We need to treat them with respect.
I love that analogy. Trees as the elders of our community. And speaking of community, Mrs. Berry made a really interesting point about the interconnectedness of this ecosystem. She was saying how the Barton Creek watershed isn't just some isolated thing. It's a vital part of what makes Austin, well, Austin.
She's absolutely right. It's all connected. The creeks, the springs, the aquifer, the trees, the wildlife. You can't just mess with one part of the ecosystem without impacting the whole thing. It's like a giant game of Jenga. You pull out the wrong piece, and the whole thing could come crashing down.
That's a pretty intense visual, but you're right, it highlights the stakes involved here. We're not just talking about one development project, we're talking about the health of an entire ecosystem that sustains us all.
Exactly. And it's not just about the science either. There's a cultural and historical dimension to this as well. The Barton Creek watershed, it's been a source of life and inspiration for generations of Austinites. It's where we go to swim, to hike, to kayak, to reconnect with nature. It's part of our identity as a city.
And speaking of identity, Austin is known for being environmentally conscious, so it seems a little counterintuitive to allow a development that could potentially harm the watershed, right?
It does seem like a bit of a contradiction, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But, it all comes back to that constant tension between growth and preservation. Austin's growing, and with that growth comes a demand for more housing, more businesses, more infrastructure. But the question is, at what cost?
Right. How do we grow in a way that doesn't destroy what makes the city so special in the first place?
It's the million-dollar question, and I don't envy the council having to make those tough decisions. But, the fact that we're even having this conversation, the fact that residents like Miss Berry are showing up and making their voices heard, that gives me hope.
Me too. It shows that people are paying attention, they're engaged, and they're willing to fight for what they believe in.
Exactly. And, it's not just individual residents who are speaking out. I'm seeing reports here from the Save Our Springs Alliance. They've weighed in on this project as well.
Oh, the Save Our Springs Alliance, they're like the environmental superheroes of Austin. I've heard their name come up a lot in these meetings. What's their take on all this?
Well, they're not too keen on this project, to put it mildly. They're raising a lot of the same concerns as Mrs. Berry: traffic, pollution, the impact on the aquifer.
Makes sense. They've been fighting to protect the Barton Creek watershed for decades.
Exactly. And they've got a pretty impressive track record. They've been instrumental in passing some of the toughest environmental regulations in the country, and they're not afraid to take developers to court if they have to.
They sound like a force to be reckoned with. So what happened? Did the council listen to their concerns?
Well, this is where things get interesting. It seems like the council is actually divided on this one.
Oh, really? A divided council. Now, that's something you don't see every day. Okay, I'm really intrigued now. Give me the details.
So some council members are siding with the residents and the environmental groups, arguing that the risks of this project far outweigh the benefits. They're concerned about the potential impact on the watershed, on traffic, on the overall quality of life in the area.
Okay, that makes sense. But if the council's divided, that means some of them must be in favor of the project, right? Why would they support something that could potentially harm the environment?
That's a great question, and it really gets at the heart of the challenges facing a city like Austin. Some council members are arguing that the city desperately needs more housing, especially affordable housing, and that this project, while not perfect, would help address that need.
So it's that classic dilemma, again, balancing the need for growth with the need for preservation. But isn't there a way to do both? To grow in a way that's sustainable, that doesn't destroy our environment in the process?
That's the goal, isn't it? But finding that balance is a lot easier said than done. It requires compromise, creativity, and a willingness to think outside the box.
And it requires listening to all sides of the issue, right? Not just the developers, but the residents, the environmental experts, the people who will have to live with the consequences of these decisions long after the council meeting is over.
Exactly. And, one of the things that struck me about this particular case was the level of detail that residents went into in their testimony. It wasn't just about MPism. It was about a deep understanding of the local ecosystem, the history of the watershed, the potential consequences of development.
It's like they'd done their homework, right? They came prepared to make their case, and they did it with passion and conviction.
Exactly. And that's what makes local government so fascinating, so inspiring. It's where everyday people can make their voices heard, where they can hold their elected officials accountable, where they can fight for the future of their communities.
Well said. And speaking of fighting for the future, this next item on the agenda takes us from the realm of environmental activism to the world of education. We're talking about a school district, the Anita Coy facility, that's looking to redevelop a property.
Okay, school redevelopment. That can be a tricky one. You've got to balance the needs of the students and the community with often limited resources.
Well,
What's the story with this particular project?
well, we're not going to believe this, but our old friend DB90 is back in the mix.
DB90. That zoning code is like the gift that keeps on giving, isn't it? Always stirring up controversy.
It's like the Energizer Bunny of zoning codes. It just keeps going and going. But seriously, this case is interesting because it ties together so many of the themes we've been talking about: affordability, neighborhood character, environmental concerns, and of course, that constant struggle for meaningful community engagement.
It's like the perfect storm of zoning drama.
Exactly. And right on cue, we've got a resident, Angela, who's ready to throw her hat into the ring. She's all for a new school facility, don't get me wrong, but she's got some serious reservations about how DB90 is being used in this project.
I'm picking up on a theme here. DB90 seems to be causing quite a stir in these parts. What's Angela's take on it?
Well, one of the things that really resonated with me was her comparison of development on the east side versus the west side of Austin. She was talking about how it feels like two different cities sometimes, with stark differences in resources, amenities, and overall quality of life.
The tale of two cities. It's a common refrain in Austin these days. And unfortunately, it's not just a matter of perception. There are real disparities that exist between different parts of the city.
Exactly. And Angela's point is that DB90, at least the way it's being implemented right now, seems to be exacerbating those inequalities.
Interesting. So how's that playing out in this particular case?
Well, she argues that the city is too quick to approve these big, dense developments in parts of town that are already struggling with traffic congestion, lack of green space, and a whole host of other challenges, while other parts of town, with more resources and political clout, seem to get a pass.
I see her point.
Mm.
It's one thing to encourage density. It's another thing to concentrate it in areas that are already feeling the strain.
Exactly. And Angela was very articulate in describing the existing infrastructure in her neighborhoods. Narrow residential streets, already struggling to handle the traffic from all the new apartments, bars, and restaurants that have popped up in recent years.
Ah, yes, the joys of rapid growth. Sometimes it feels like the infrastructure just can't keep up.
Exactly. And now imagine adding a large-scale school redevelopment to that mix without addressing those underlying issues.
Yeah.
It's a recipe for gridlock.
And not just traffic gridlock, right?
Yeah.
But also a strain on other resources, water, sewer, parks, schools.
Exactly. It's like trying to squeeze a size 10 foot into a size 6 shoe. Something's got to give.
And usually it's the residents who end up feeling the pinch.
Exactly. And it's not just about inconvenience either. There are real quality of life issues at stake here. People moved to these neighborhoods for a certain quality of life, quiet streets, a sense of community, access to green space, and they're right to be concerned when those things are threatened by unchecked development.
Absolutely. It's
Yeah.
about protecting what makes a neighborhood special, what makes it livable.
Exactly. And, it's not just about the built environment either. Angela also brought up the environmental piece, which is always a hot button issue in Austin.
Of course. We can't talk about development in Austin without talking about the environment. It's in our DNA.
Right. So Angela was specifically concerned about the impact of this project on the fragile aquifer in the area. She even got up a previous development project, Storyville, I think it was called.
Storyville, yeah, I remember that one. Wasn't that the project that ran into some trouble with the aquifer?
Yep, that's the one. They actually struck the aquifer during construction, which led to a massive loss of water.
Oh, wow, yeah, that was a big deal. It was a real wake-up call for a lot of people.
And it's a stark reminder that we're not just building on empty
Yeah.
land here. We're building on top of a complex and interconnected ecosystem that we don't always fully understand.
Exactly. And the Edwards Aquifer in particular, that's not something you want to mess with. It's the source of drinking water for millions of people, and it's already under a lot of stress from drought, population growth, and pollution.
So hearing about a development project that's right in the heart of the recharge zone for the aquifer, that's definitely cause for concern.
Absolutely. And it highlights the need for a more holistic approach to development, one that takes into account not just the immediate needs of a particular project, but also the long-term health and sustainability of the entire community.
Right. It's about thinking beyond the next quarter, the next fiscal year, the next election cycle. It's about making decisions that will benefit our children and grandchildren, not just ourselves.
Well said. And, it's not just about the big picture either. It's about the little things, too, like making sure that new developments have adequate sidewalks and bike lanes so people can get around without having to rely on cars.
Yes, and making sure there's enough green space so people have a place to relax, to play, to connect with nature.
Exactly. It's about creating communities, not just buildings.
And that brings us back to the heart of this whole DB90 debate, doesn't it? It's not just about density. It's about how that density is implemented and whether it's done in a way that benefits the entire community, not just a select few.
Exactly. And, one of the things that I always find myself coming back to in these conversations is the issue of process. How are these decisions being made? Who's at the table? Are all voices being heard?
That's such an important point. Because even with the best of intentions, if the process is flawed, if it's not transparent and inclusive, then the outcome is likely to be flawed as well.
Exactly. And unfortunately, in this case, it seems like the process has left some residents feeling frustrated and unheard.
I'm seeing that in the transcripts, yeah.
Hmm.
There's a lot of frustration expressed about the city's notification process, or lack thereof.
It's a common complaint, and for good reason. People feel like they're being left in the dark, like decisions are being made about their neighborhoods without their input.
And that's a recipe for distrust and resentment, right?
Absolutely. And it undermines the whole idea of a participatory democracy.
Exactly. It's not enough to just have public hearings. People need to feel like they're actually being heard, that their concerns are being taken seriously.
And that their feedback is actually being incorporated into the decision-making process.
Exactly. Because at the end of the day, it's the residents who have to live with the consequences of these decisions long after the developers have moved on to the next project.
Right. They're the ones who have to deal with the traffic, the noise, the strain on infrastructure. They're the ones who have to look at these buildings every day.
So it's only fair that they have a say in what their neighborhoods look like, right?
Absolutely. It's their city, too.
As we've been navigating this maze of zoning disputes, environmental concerns, and community clashes, it's become increasingly clear that we're dealing with something bigger than just a few isolated incidents. It's like we're witnessing a city grappling with its own growing pains, trying to reconcile its past with its future.
I couldn't agree more. And this next item on the agenda, it really brings all of those tensions to the forefront. We're talking about a proposed development project that's reignited that familiar debate: affordability versus neighborhood character.
It's like a tale as old as time, growth versus preservation, progress versus tradition.
And in a city like Austin, where change is the only constant, that debate is always going to be fraught with passion, with complexity, and sometimes with a healthy dose of frustration.
Well, speaking of frustration, we hear from a resident, David, who's got a bone to pick with the city's approach to development.
Oh boy, David doesn't mince words. I've seen him at other meetings. He's always eager to share his perspective. What's his beef this time?
Well, he starts off by acknowledging the elephant in the room, the affordability crisis that's gripping Austin. He gets it. People need places to live, and he's not opposed to development in principle.
Okay, so where's the but? There's always a but.
Right. His but is that he feels like the city is going about it the wrong way. He argues that they're too quick to approve these massive, out-of-scale developments that he claims are completely out of character with the surrounding neighborhoods.
That's a common refrain, especially in these older, more established neighborhoods that were built in a time when density wasn't exactly the goal.
Exactly. And he's not just talking about aesthetics either. He's talking about the very real impact these developments have on traffic, parking, noise, and the overall quality of life in the neighborhood.
It's that sense of place, that feeling of knowing your neighbors, of having a sense of community. Those things are hard to quantify, but they're what make a neighborhood special, what make it home.
Right. And those are the things that are often lost in the name of progress, in the pursuit of density at all costs.
And it's not just about the residents who are already there. It's also about the people who are moving into these new developments.
Yeah.
They deserve to live in a place that's well-planned, well-designed, and integrated into the fabric of the community.
Exactly. It's about creating a city that works for everyone, not just for the developers who are profiting from these projects.
Well said. And David made another point that really resonated with me. He talked about the lack of green space in many of these new developments.
Right. It's like they're just cramming as many units onto a lot as possible, with little regard for things like parks, trees, or even just a little bit of breathing room.
It's like they've forgotten that human beings need nature. We need those spaces to relax, to recharge, to connect with something bigger than ourselves.
Exactly. And those spaces, they're not just amenities. They're essential for our physical and mental well-being. They're what make a city livable.
And they're especially important in a city like Austin, where we're blessed with such natural beauty. But if we're not careful, we're going to pave over it all in the name of progress.
It's a cautionary tale, for sure. And it brings us back to that fundamental question, what kind of city do we want to be?
Right. What do we value? What are we willing to fight for?
And are we willing to make the tough choices necessary to create a city that's both prosperous and livable, both innovative and sustainable, both dynamic and inclusive?
Those are the million-dollar questions, my friend. And unfortunately, I don't think there are any easy answers. But you know what? The fact that we're even asking these questions, that we're having these conversations, that gives me hope.
Me too. Because it shows that we care about the future of the city. We care about its people, its environment, its character. And as long as we keep caring, as long as we keep talking, as long as we keep demanding better, I think we have a fighting chance of getting it right.
Hear, hear. And, as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of Austin City Council, it's clear that we've only just scratched the surface.
Right. There are so many other issues that we didn't even have time to touch on.
But hopefully, this gives our listeners a taste of what's going on in their local government. the challenges we face as a city, and the incredible passion and dedication of the people who are working to make Austin a better place for everyone.
Exactly. So to everyone listening out there, stay curious, stay engaged, and most importantly, stay involved. Your voice matters, and your city needs you.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time for us to sign off. Until next time, Austin.
Keep it weird and keep it engaged.